So hopefully I can do this extrapolation on what Adam Galinsky was talking about in just one more video. I've been alluding to it, but now I'm here. But one more thing is that the woman who was speaking up about being queer in a country where it's not okay was saying something about she has to speak up because there's an enormous sense of responsibility that would haunt her. And I actually feel in a way that so-called psychosis is this sense of enormous responsibility that haunts us. It's like feeling the whole responsibility of all of the human collective unconscious, and it's haunting us all, that whole collective unconscious. It's not my bad thoughts and your bad thoughts or whatever, it's part of the whole collective, and some of us get thrust into having access to that information, and it's very scary. Just like the information in so-called mania is very ecstatic and wonderful and beautiful and magical. What goes up must come down, but what goes up very slowly in an unfolding of understanding doesn't necessarily fall back down. We'll see. We'll see if unfolding one's understanding for oneself in self-dialogue is somewhat of an antidote to Humpty Dumpty syndrome, falling down too quickly and breaking apart, and then having the medical establishment trying to glue us back together, when we could probably just put ourselves back together if we had enough time, space, love, and understanding. So anyways, so I do have this sense of this enormous responsibility. And when so-called mania and psychosis, that energy is back in my awareness, I'm aware of all these things that I'm responsible for, directly and indirectly, as being a member of the human world. And all of the world is within us to understand, and we're all part of it, and we're all co-creating it. So we're all responsible for it. And it does feel like an enormous sense of responsibility. Like in so-called mania, people might say, I'm God, or I have to save the world, or I have to do this, or we're just very active. And then when that flips into so-called psychosis, we might say things like, I did all of this, I'm so bad, or fear like we might do something bad, or feel like we did something bad, not sure, but really that's just part of all of the collective unconsciousness, all the infinite possibilities of so-called good, and then all the possibilities of so-called bad, but they're all related to the level of consciousness. So we all have access to all the levels of consciousness, and our ego keeps us in some kind of semblance of equilibrium, but really it's just ignoring everything that's happening in order to protect ourselves. And then when that breaks apart and we realize we're not a separate self, we're all part of this, we're all responsible, we all could do something. We don't know. At first we try to do so much in so-called mania, and then when that sort of runs out of energy, we feel like, I did all this, I'm so bad, I'm responsible for it all, and that is actually quite lethal. So what it really does, though, is recalibrate our nervous system to see all potentialities, and thus be more attuned to empathetically respond in the moment moving forward, if we can survive the recalibration. And when we go into so-called recovery and just sort of try to glue our ego back together and go on with life as it was, or usually a shadow of what it was, but still within that same self-preserving framework, we're sort of missing the point of what that energy was showing us, is that we're not separate, and we're here to do something. I don't know what, but by doing nothing, we're doing something. By just walking through life and operating with that empathy, we are doing something. We're not doing nothing. And I feel like a lot of us get more attuned to empathy, and then we're never able to really understand it, so we're left on the outside, we're left in the margins, but really we can see a lot more than people who haven't been through those states. So I'm digressing, but anyways. So I listened to Adam Galinsky's TED Talk after hearing about him on the TED Radio Hour about speaking up. And he talks about how there's a moral factor, a social support and allies factor, and an expertise factor in the decision to speak up. And I feel like I'm just speaking up, and when I do share this, I might have some allies, maybe not. I don't know if I would be seen as having expertise. I don't know if I do. I'm not really wanting that. I don't want expertise at all. If I decide to be an expert in something, that actually eliminates the capacity to perceive other things. It creates sort of a tunnel vision, and that's something I don't want. So perhaps being an expert in not being an expert, or being an expert at understanding and unfolding meaning for oneself. Whether or not other people see it that way, it doesn't matter. Because if we're all trying to operate based on what we think other people are seeing it as, then it's just confusion. So if we can at least produce understanding for ourselves, then it could actually eliminate confusion in the whole. So this is where it gets interesting. He talks about the range of acceptable behavior and how it expands and contracts based on the context. It's not a fixed thing. So if I have a boss and I'm speaking with my boss, my range of acceptable behavior changes than if I'm hanging out with a child. Or with my boss, I might not be able to speak up at all, but with a child, I might be able to be silly and goofy and say ridiculous things and just have fun, but I couldn't act that way in front of my boss. So the range of acceptable behavior changes. And to me, this is important in that it relates to what I've been talking about with how be aware of who we have in front of us. It's the same thing. If I'm sitting in a psychiatrist's office, my range of acceptable behavior is very limited. I have to sit there, answer the questions, as if I want to answer those questions, as if I want to be in that office. So I have to sort of play that role, and that really limits my range of acceptable behavior. So if I'm always in clinical settings, or mostly, and then just go home by myself and watch TV, I'm going to be living a very narrow life in terms of the behaviors and gestures that are going to create my life by virtue of the situations and the context and the people I'm putting in front of me. So I talked recently about how changing the people that are in front of us and that we can be open with is important to have some people like that. So I would say be around people that your range increases. And interestingly enough, in map consciousness, in so-called mania, one's range of acceptable behavior increases vastly to oneself without fear of reward or punishment. So it actually, what is really acceptable behavior? It's either being rewarded or punished for one's behavior. And that's duality. That's thinking about the programs of the social morality. And really, map consciousness is getting us in touch with a different morality. A morality of discovering morality for oneself, not by going based on the influences of the programming. And we'll still discover a morality, and it'll be different and more integrated because we'll have discovered it for ourselves. And it's a different morality even in, say we're in so-called mania, we're feeling so magical and powerful, and then all of a sudden we make it a part of our ego and we want to get rich because of it. All of a sudden we find ourselves in so-called psychosis. It's because we tried to put the social morality of success and goals and making a lot of money at the expense of other people into the living morality of the moment, putting a goal and a motive into it, which is projecting the future from the past. And that's just an example. That's not all of it. That's just a very small example. And I'm not saying everyone that wants to make money just wants to be rich for themselves, but it's just once we sort of feel powerful and then we think in terms of the old programming that money is power, and then we want to use that power to get money, that's going to weaken the nervous system according to this living morality that it's building. So it pulls us down. It says, no, you're not. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves in so-called psychosis and medicalized and on drugs from the psychiatric system. And the point of that is not to say, oh, well, just keep doing that forever. Just keep taking the pills. Just keep being a medical patient. It's begin again and learn again from the beginning. It's a game. Like, to learn this way of being and operating is a game. It's a different game. And just because we fall off our bike as a 5-year-old doesn't mean we never get back on and try again. Why wouldn't we jump back on the bike of our own human nervous system in our own life, in our own game? This is our life. And we don't jump back on the bike. So interestingly enough, I think part of what is missing in what Adam Galinsky's saying from my own perspective is that these programs of reward and punishment are what block power. And he talks about power. He says, your power determines your range. So in the example of being with a child, I have more power over the child by virtue of being an adult. So I can kind of do anything. I can yell at the child, or I can play with the child, or anything. So in myself, I might feel like there's a lot of acceptable behaviors around the child, yet I have more power over the child. So if they act a certain way, I will punish them and limit their range of acceptable behaviors. And in this way, I teach them their acceptable range of behaviors, and they carry that with them. We condition them with this power structure. And in so-called mania, it's a huge surge in power, so we get a huge range of acceptable behaviors. And what happens is we move in that energy of feeling like all these behaviors are acceptable. From our perspective, society over time, through how they respond to us, are like, that's not acceptable, that's not acceptable, that's not acceptable, until we've just basically shriveled up into not being able to do anything. And part of the reason why at some point it gets to a scary point of not being able to do anything or running in fear is because we realize we're being recaptured into the social order of responding based on social programs of what is acceptable and not acceptable, reward and punishment. So the power of so-called mania, that energy, moves us beyond reward and punishment. But the longer we move in that field, eventually we are again susceptible to the order of reward and punishment. And it feels like a punishment to be losing that state beyond reward and punishment. And so we actually can run in fear, and then it's actually mirrored in reality, where like the police are chasing us, or families are dragging us into the psych ward, or we're arrested and taken into the psych ward. It's just sort of an outer manifestation of falling out of that feeling of freedom from operating outside of reward and punishment. And really, reward and punishment is embedded in our nervous system. It's what stops us from just acting. Instead of acting, I sort of think first, oh, is this going to be bad or good? Or am I going to get something good or bad? But in that field of magic, we're just moving fluidly and sort of learning as we go. And then the trouble is, the longer we're in that, we sort of learn as we go that it's not okay to be like that. It's not okay to be that dynamic, that fluid, that free. And we can sort of be that way for a while, but at some point, something as simple as a family member saying, you're not yourself, is like, well, who am I? Who do you think I am? Like, am I who you programmed me to be, or the whole world programmed me to be? I don't think that's really who we are. And if we even just look at that 1950s housewife video on YouTube of her on LSD, which one is her? The one of her on LSD, or the one of her being told by the researcher, oh, you're normal according to tests? Normal and dull and boring and whatever. But so we get this huge surge in power, and then eventually the gravity of the social structure, which is everywhere except that field of energy that we're able to move in for a certain period of time, sort of again just closes in on us and recaptures us in the bubble of society, and then puts us on meds and is like, it's not okay to be that way. Just take your meds for the rest of your life and you'll be fine. You won't be that way. The mind is trying to free itself from itself. The mind is trying to free itself of these social programs. So what Adam Galinsky is talking about is still within the realm of social programs, but it's still valuable to sort of understand some of these mechanisms, especially for people who move into states that move their being into operating beyond social programs. To have an awareness of how they operate, it can actually be a compass, it can be a guide. It's sort of like having a better map than the next person because one can see from a different vantage point. It doesn't make the other map completely obsolete, but it's like having different information, just a more vast map. And the more that we understand the structure and this mechanism, the more we can see it in operation. It might not change what the mechanism eventually does. We might still get captured by society every time. But at least we won't be as afraid. We will know, oh, at some point I'll be able to start again. And that state and that energy and that perception is so much more powerful that once one has operated in that way a few times, it's easy to get back. It's kind of like just being able to just go into that state without having to really try. It's just like if we learn to walk as a child and then we have an injury and we can't walk for a year, we're going to be able to walk. We still remember how. It just might take a little while for the muscles to get some strength. We still have that pattern within ourselves of understanding how to do that and in the brain. So these tracks and patterns and blueprints and maps still get laid down in the brain. So it's never a waste. It's never a failure. It's just learning to live in that energy again and being able to expand our range of acceptable behaviors for maybe a longer period of time in that energy. And so many people crave that state of mania because it does expand our range of acceptable behavior. We become more creative. We actually create our behavior as we go. It's not like we just add 10 gestures that we can do. We add a gesture in a moment of an action that we never even knew we had. And we see we have capacities of range of movement and motion and dynamism and expression that we just never knew were there, and we only know we're there by having that power and then the moment inviting that out. So the way society's designed right now, the moments don't invite that out. But when that energy comes in, it just brings it out. But then eventually the momentum of society just kind of squashes that at some point. But it provides somewhat of a blueprint for how to move about and maybe slowly expand the range of acceptable behaviors. And this to me is related to harvest, practice, and body. Harvest that expanded range of acceptable behaviors that were acceptable to us when we were in that state where we felt powerful and beautiful and in alignment with our true selves. But others couldn't see that. But having an awareness of that, we can then practice that and slowly expand those instead of just waiting for the state and the energy to bring it back and just sort of kamikazing out with our gestures until we land again in the psych ward and get even more chemicalized and told, oh, your condition's getting worse. It's not that way. It's not a linear thing. It's not a time thing. It's something that we accessed and we can get back to, but we can actually unfold it and in time and embed it more in our neurology by participating with that understanding of the expanded ranges of acceptable behaviors. And then Adam Galinsky talked about something really interesting. He talked about the low power double bind, which is something along the lines of when we have low power, if we don't speak up because we have low power, we don't really get noticed or we don't really get our needs met. But if we do speak up, we'll probably get punished. And I feel like all people who get labeled and pathologized are in a low power double bind. Pretty much every situation we're in, we don't have the power to speak up, but if we ever do muster it, it's misinterpreted, we get punished. So if I share that I'm having some interesting perceptions, I'll just get more medication because of the fact that I'm in a relationship that is a very extreme power differential. When really these interesting perceptions are a sign of power, and then the power over me of the psychiatrist gives me something to take away that power. And he also gives the example of gender differences and how we think, and how really the whole thing that happens with gender differences isn't a gender thing specifically, but the fact that women don't have as much power as men. And that's really fascinating to me too. And that's why, with that situation a little while ago, where I felt sort of powerful telling somebody to just get out, I felt like I did have more power in that moment. And so I feel it's really important to not do anything that would take my power away in terms of the power in my nervous system, the power of expression, the power of perception and expression. So I actually feel like self-dialogue is a way to eventually overcome this low power double bind, because one starts to feel more powerful in oneself, and not in terms of power over others, but just being able to powerfully speak one's truth, and then not fear the punishment, because also one is able to be more aware of when to say things to who and stuff like that. So the things that I say to myself, I just say to myself. But then sometimes the context and communication I've created for myself actually does trickle out into my daily life, and it is more and more over time. So it's a way to build the power of my own communication in my nervous system, so then when the moment does call for it, it can arise because I've already created it for myself. And this could seem somewhat contrived, but really it's trying to overcome the gravity of all of the history of hundreds of years of psychiatry and what that's would want to do to me, and then make money off of me for that. And so this really is a way to sort of withstand some of that gravity and vortex energy trying to pull me back into that. And even if I do get pulled back into it, I'll know that I can get myself out of it again, because it's a very powerful vortex. And what else is going to move me away from that but my own understanding, my own perceptions, giving voice to my own insights about this. And it looks like I have one more video to make.